Becca.
Okay, try that again. Hi, Ian. Am I coming in to you guys? Can you hear me?
Yes, Lisa, you look.
See you.
Yep.
Excellent. I will stop talking.
Hi, Stella. Hi, Ian.
Hello. Who is this?
This is Sean DeBleek with the auditor's
Oh.
office.
Oh, wonderful.
Nice to meet you.
Same here.
I'm going to switch to mute.
I will too.
The first hello to Cheryl.
Hi.
Howdy there, this is Parker Dawson. Can you all hear me?
Can hear you,
Yes.
Parker.
Fantastic. I wasn't able to quickly get audio working on my desktop here, so I joined as well via phone. Glad to see so many people on early. We'll be hopefully getting started in exactly 10 minutes once all of our folks are in the call. If you've got any questions or last minute questions or need to get quick access to any documents that you can't find currently, feel free to ask and I can get those sent over your way really quick. But otherwise, thank you all for being here.
Oh, well, I have a question. Did you send documents about the city auditor and the IG's offices?
I have not sent those over yet. We do have
Oh, okay.
presentations from both offices.
Okay.
Imagining it may be helpful, I will send those all over to you as well so that you can look along on your own. The presentations will be shared during their presentations though.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Hello.
Hi.
All right, those presentations were just sent.
So I don't know how to get my screen to come on.
Bottom of my screen has a thing that says stop video or mute, and you can click on it to get the.
So start video?
Pardon?
You say start video?
Yeah, your screen might say something different than mine. Mine just says stop video or mute. And so I can click on those if I don't want the video or I don't want audio.
Let's see that. There we go.
Voila! I think Parker said he'd start the meeting, or we'll start the meeting right at 2 if everybody's here.
Looks like we are waiting on Justin Marlowe, Bob Thomas, and our chair, Andrew Lewis. That should be starting here in just a couple of minutes. Welcome, Robert and Councilmember Lewis. Looks like the last person that we're waiting on is Justin Marlowe from the UW Evans School to be joining us. If you will give me a quick minute, I'll try and give him a call and make sure that he's on his way. Otherwise, we'll get started here as on time as possible.
Okay. Hey, Parker, are you on here? Parker?
Yes, I am. And we just had Justin Marlowe join, so we are in full attendance.
Oh, great. Okay, perfect. Well, I'll kick it off then. Here, I just want to make sure I have the agenda in front of me. Okay, great. Okay. And then we also, so IT's all handled, and we have like the call-in number available for people that want to.
Yes, we've got a couple members of the public watching right now.
Oh, good. And are they under the participant tab?
Yes.
Oh, I see. As attendees. Oh, great.
Mhm.
Excellent. Well, good. Okay, perfect. Well, I will jump in, and we have Lisa Kay from Central Staff on here as well. That's good. Okay. Well, I'll get started. So it's good to see everybody in person here, virtually on the Zoom app. I think I've talked to pretty much everybody here in person. If not, I hope to at some point over the next couple of months. And so first, I just want to say thank you for being a part of this and welcome. And you know, I personally, I can't think of anything better to do during, you know, for my downtime during a pandemic than talk about performance auditing and ways to have a more efficacious and responsive city government. And, you know, this is really something that I've developed you know, like an amateur policy interest in over the last couple of years from a lot of friends and people who have had experience in legislative bodies who just speak to the power and potential of performance auditing to really make sure that we are constantly driving a you know, a culture of persistent improvement in how we deliver services in government, and making sure that government and government policies are responsive to the concerns of the people that we represent, as well as making sure that executive government is responsive to the concerns and priorities of the legislative branch. So these are things that when I became a city council member, and for those of you who aren't aware, my name is, I should start by introducing myself. Sorry. My name is Andrew Lewis. I'm the Seattle City Council member for District 7. For those who are familiar with Seattle, represents the neighborhoods of Magnolia, Queen Anne, downtown, South Lake Union, and Pioneer Square. Prior to being elected, I served as an assistant city attorney in the Seattle City Attorney's Office. And I'm a lifelong Seattle resident, lived here my entire life, and I'm really proud to represent my neighbors on the Seattle City Council. In terms of the origin of this stakeholder group that you know, Parker Dawson, who's on this Zoom meeting, was instrumental in helping me put together, and I know a lot of folks on here have talked to Parker extensively. You know, we really wanted to make sure that we were assembling a group of folks with very strong technocratic expertise, with demonstrated community involvement, and folks who are stakeholders in city government who could inform this process from a standpoint of making sure that we're considering things that could actually be implemented and things that would actually have a lasting and strong impact on how city government in Seattle operates. We wanted to make sure that we had folks come in from outside of the Seattle system, and you know, I'm really excited to be working with Levon Griffin-Velade, who's on this call and part of the group, who was the elected auditor in Portland, Oregon. I think having that outside perspective is going to be really helpful too, to provide some context to some of the things we're considering for folks who have mostly been within the King County City of Seattle system. So in terms of how this is going to work, Parker, who is on the call, and Lisa Kay from our City of Seattle Central staff are going to be the primary staff contacts throughout this process. I'm also really excited to have David Jones, the Seattle City Auditor, as well as Lisa Judge, our Inspector General for the Seattle Public Safety, who has a very large auditing function of one of our largest public agencies, the Seattle Police Department. Their expertise is going to be really instrumental too in terms of what recommendations coming out of this process can really go toward helping them to have the tools they need for efficacious interventions and to provide information to the public and to the legislative branch on what we can be doing better as a city and how we can be doing it. So I think what I want to do before I share a little bit more about scope of work is I want to hand it over and do member introductions, go through everybody real quick for just kind of name, background, and what you hope to contribute throughout this process and for the duration that we're all serving here together. So I think if we could keep those comments to maybe like less than 3 minutes to make sure that we can maybe get off the call a little early today, because just to do a quick overview before we do that of the agenda, we had the chair's welcome, which I'm wrapping up now, member introductions. We then are going to go a little bit into scope of work. We're going to approve the bylaws of this group, and Lisa Kay will introduce and discuss those, as well as kind of our decision-making protocol for how we're going to kind of manage things as a group. And then finally, we'll just do some brief overviews of kind of where we stand now in terms of the Office of the City Auditor and the Office of the Inspector General, to sort of get a good idea of kind of the lay of the land. And by that point, we can call it good for our first meeting, and I'll work with Lisa and Parker, Lisa Kay and Parker, to set up our first substantive meeting, and an agenda will be distributed before then to inform our deliberations going forward. So with that, why don't we jump into it and do member introductions? I think just to keep this flowing along, since we're doing this on a Zoom call, I'm going to go down the panelist list, and so I'll call folks out, and when I do that, I'll say the 2 people that are on deck to do introductions, and we'll go down the panelist list. So Cheryl Broom is the first person on the list. So if she's ready to jump in, I'll hand it over to Cheryl, and then we'll go to Levon Griffin-Velade and Robert Thomas. So Cheryl, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Councilmember Lewis. Yes, I'm Cheryl Broom. My background includes many, many years of performance auditing and related accountability and oversight work. I was the King County Auditor for 12 years, the Legislative Auditor for the State of Washington for 12 years, and also the First Deputy Inspector General for the New York State MTA. The organizations I've been involved in have been oriented towards doing high impact, quality, objective work that can be used by policymakers and government administrators. And I think we have a good track record for that. So I'm looking forward to contribute where possible to the advancement of performance auditing in the City of Seattle through this committee.
Hi, I'm Levon Griffin-Velade, and I served as the elected auditor of the City of Portland, Oregon, from May 2008 through the end of 2014. Prior to that, I was the elected auditor of Multnomah County, which would be similar to first being elected the King County Auditor and then being elected the Auditor of the City of Seattle. Prior to being an elected auditor of either jurisdiction, I was a senior performance auditor on staff in the Multnomah County Auditor's Office. All told, I have 16 years experience of local government performance auditing. I should add that the Multnomah County Auditor's Office primarily conducts performance audits, but also manages the contract with the firm carrying out the annual financial audit. That is also true of the City of Portland, but Portland's city auditor manages multiple programs in addition to audit services. Those additional programs include the Office of the Ombudsman, the Independent Police Review Function, which investigates community complaints about possible officer misconduct, the City Clerk function, the Archives function, and the City Hearings Office. And I am hoping to contribute my expertise of being an independent auditor, and also my expertise in performance auditing and my love of the profession and the ideals that government auditing professionals follow. Oops, excuse me.
Okay, I think I'm next, Bob Thomas. Robert Thomas, you have my name down, call me Bob. I have 35 years experience doing performance audits as an analyst and as a, sometimes a little bit reluctantly as a manager and administrator in different agencies. And during that career, I've managed all kinds of contracts, large and small. And at the same time, almost over the same period of time, 3.5 decades, I've also been a consultant. And again, I've been involved with very large and very small, almost every flavor of kind of consultant evaluation that you can think of. And so I know that that's one of the things that was on the list, is to talk about the role of doing consulting in the Seattle City Auditor's Office. And so that's one area where I think I have at least a lot of experience looking at it from kind of both directions. And so I'm hoping that at least in that one area, I can lend my expertise. And then also, just because I've been involved in performance auditing almost my entire career, that there'll be other areas I can help contribute to as well.
Great, thank you. So then next up we have Estella Ortega, and then David Jones, and then Justin Marlowe.
Hi, this is Estella Ortega, and I'm not sure if you can see me. I had troubles with the audio and got bumped off, and so now I think I'm just on audio. Well, Estella Ortega, I'm the executive director of El Centro de la Raza and also one of the co-founders. And so I've actually been in one place for 47 years, and clearly understand the importance of audits in terms of being accountable to how funds are spent. El Centro works very hard ongoingly to ensure that we have clean audits. We understand the value of audits and the role they play in determining the credibility of a nonprofit organizations. And I think one important thing that we've learned over the years is that the audit does not lie just in the office of the controller or in the office of, you know, our financial department, but everyone in the organization is involved in an audit in one way or the other to assure that you're going to have a clean audit. We have, as a nonprofit, we have to send our audits to all of our funders. It's published on a national register, and it has to be readily available to the public who asks for it. And we also have our audit posted on our website, and also that includes our 990. And so I come from the vantage point of how is community going to be involved in audits, in these type of audits, and is the work of the auditor available to the most marginalized, and is there mechanisms in place for transparency? So, I'm going to raise questions like, how are community resources being utilized? Are they being utilized for what they were intended for? Is it equitable? Is it serving those that are furthest from opportunity? So I have, a number of questions. Also, I understand that the auditor's office utilizes the Race and Social Justice Initiative tool questions, and obviously questions around that are in the form of, does this toolkit adequately address equity concerns, and is there a role for community? Are auditors trained adequately on the RSJI toolkit? And is community involvement evaluated as a part of the audit process? So I wrap it up there in saying that we as a committee are in a unique position in terms of thinking of how an audit can best serve government and community, and how can we utilize traditional tools while developing tools to ensure that the city is moving towards equity. And so I'm very excited about the possibility of examining these questions together and putting systems in place for it, for the benefit of all people, and working with each of you. So thank you very much.
I believe I'm next. I'm David Jones, the Seattle City Auditor, and I just want to thank all of you for being here and lending your expertise. It's quite a group, and I know I'm going to learn a lot from all of you. So I've been involved with performance auditing since I think 1985. So my experience, I worked with the Office of Financial Management, Olympia. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. Then I went to OFM in Olympia, worked there. And then I, after going to school, getting my master's degree, I went and worked with the U.S. Government Accountability Office, spent a number of years in the Washington, D.C. area and also overseas. And then because I'm originally from Seattle, eventually I had an opportunity to come back here and work for the Office of City Auditor, started out as an auditor, then became the deputy. And I've had the great privilege of being the city auditor. I think I'm on my third term now. And I'm very proud of the work the office does. And, particularly to the extent that I'm really proud of how we have spent a lot of time looking at equity issues. I think that's really important in the context of the city's Race and Social Justice Initiative and just a lot of what's going on nowadays. And I'll be excited to hear anything we can learn on that front further.
Great. And then I think next we were going to do Justin Marlowe, and then Lisa Judge, and then I think oh, it looks like the list has been bouncing around a little bit. That's why I'm getting confused. But yeah, Justin Marlowe, and then let's do Lisa Judge, and then Sean Van Eyck. I know hasn't gone yet, and I don't see him on my list anymore. Oh no, there he is. Okay, perfect, great. All right, go ahead, Justin.
Terrific. Thank you, Councilmember Lewis. Appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to join you all here and to be a part of this. My name is Justin Marlowe. I'm a professor in the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the UW, and have been there for about a decade. I'm about to depart there, but we'll be there long enough to see through the work of this group. And I teach and do research on public budgeting and finance in lots of the different areas that are very relevant to performance auditing, whether it's cost accounting, financial reporting, financial transparency, budgeting, performance, program evaluation, all the different sort of pieces that go into the performance audit function. I've done a lot of work, a lot of research, and a lot of teaching of those courses over the years. I've been a big supporter and frankly a big fan of performance auditing. I think it's a really, really important profession, as has been mentioned here before, with a lot of power and a lot of potential. So the opportunity to contribute something that might help it work a little bit more effectively in Seattle is a real pleasure and a real honor of mine. So I look forward to the conversation. I know I've met several of you, and I think we know a lot of the same folks from the performance audit community. So I look forward to tapping into that and being part of the conversation. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Justin. So let's move on to Lisa Judge, our Inspector General, if she's still on the line here.
I am. In fact, I
There
started
you
to
are.
talk and introduce myself, but I was on mute. So I still haven't learned that Zoom lesson yet. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to be included in this group. Thank you, Councilmember Lewis, and really look forward to working with everybody. I'm the newcomer to auditing. I spent the majority of my career as a police attorney advising the Tucson Police Department. So I was with them for about 24 years before I came to Seattle in 2018 to start up the Office of Inspector General. So I don't come from any auditing background, and I try to convince all of the recruiters who were trying to get me here that I really had no idea what auditing was about, but I've got a great staff of some excellent auditors, and I've undertaken to learn as much as I can about auditing in the short time I've been around, and to keep on with my auditing education. But I come essentially from a risk management and policy focused background, representing a fairly large police department. So I've done work nationally with the International Association of Chiefs of Police on their policy committee for about 8 years. And a large part of my function as a police attorney, as you might imagine, advising a department of over 1,000 people who drive fast with guns and while looking at computers, risk management was a big part of it. So I bring some of my policy development and policy lens and my risk management lens to this office, and that, in collaboration with the expertise of my auditors, has allowed us to perform some functions which I'll describe later. We've got a presentation, so you'll learn more about my office, who we are, what we do, and what authority we have later. But I just want to say, really looking forward to conversations with this group and learning from you, and lending whatever I can to the effort. So thank you.
Thank you. And Sean, are you on? Sean Van Dyke from Protect Local 17.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Councilmember. My name is Sean Van Eyck. I'm an attorney and a union representative for Protect 17, formerly PTE Local 17. We're the largest union of city employees of the city of Seattle, and I'm one of 3 staff members that support our membership there. That's nearly 3,000 employees. I don't have an auditing background, so I'm probably the most novice on that front. But I'm very much, for those folks that I've worked opposite at the city, I'm known as kind of a systems guy. I just negotiated our last contract with the city for coalition, and a lot of the language that we developed was focused on fixing problems systemically throughout the city. And I think that's one of my biggest frustrations in operating opposite the city is that because of the federated model, each of the departments is its own employer, and they do a lot of things differently, and there's a lot of duplication. So I think the value I bring is my interest in solving problems systematically, as well as my access to a membership that spreads across nearly every department in the city, which will, I think, hopefully bring to this committee the eyes of the people on the ground doing the work. I think there's oftentimes a difference between what the folks at the top perceive their organizations doing and what the people actually doing the work are doing. So I'm hopeful that brings value to this organization. So I look forward to working with you all.
Perfect. And now, did I, before I move on to Parker and Lisa Kay, did I miss any members of the group here? Just because the panelists have kind of jumped around a little on the list, so my strategy of just going down the list was very quickly thwarted. But I'm pretty sure that I did get everybody. So why don't we move on to Parker first, and then I think Lisa Kay on central staff is going to have, in addition to her introduction, sort of a general overview and presentation. So why don't we do Parker first and then move on to Lisa. So Parker, are you on there? Parker, you might be muted. All right, well, while Parker's getting that sorted out, why don't we move on to Lisa Kay on central staff. Lisa's been really great throughout this process of helping shepherd the authorizing resolution through, really working on our bylaws and some of the other ways by which this committee is going to function going forward. And I wanted to turn it over to her for for her own introduction, and then if Lisa wants to give us a presentation, an overview of kind of some of the materials that she has put together for the governance and how this group will conduct its work, I think that'd be welcome at this time as well. So Lisa, why don't you take it away?
Certainly, thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee members, I'm Lisa Kay. I'm on the Council's central staff. I'm excited to be doing this work. I have a passion for audits myself. Auditing has been, or the City Auditor's Office has been in my portfolio at Seattle for a couple of years. Before that, I staffed a committee on the King County Council that had lead responsibility for overseeing the audits, or hearing the audits. First right of refusal, basically, for hearing the audits. And I work with Mr. DeBleek, who's on the line too, who is Mr. Jones's deputy. So it's an exciting time to be doing this. I've worked in local government for 25 years or so, and both executive and legislative side, city manager side, as a manager, a policy analyst, all sorts of stuff. So I've got two, Mr. Chair, I've got two presentations I could give. I would be counting on Parker to be able to forward through the PowerPoint. So my screen is showing that he's on. I'll look at him. He's got it right here. Okay, so I'm gonna have to shrink this because I've got talking points somewhere else. This is problem. So if you can give me a minute, my talking points just got covered when you went to the full screen here. Parker, is there a way to temporarily shift that?
And while Lisa's finding that, or is anyone able to hear me now?
I can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic. Sorry about that mute issue. I had headphones that were plugged in that were supposed to have a microphone, but I guess it's not working. So really quickly before Lisa Kay gets started, thank you, Councilmember Lewis. My name is Parker Dawson. I serve as the council member's district director and policy advisor on various issues across our office, but specifically for this, government oversight. We've been working to get this up and running for now 4 months, so we're incredibly excited to get rolling here. So yeah, I'll be helping Lisa Kay get through her presentation on the draft scope of work and schedule, and then talk about the draft bylaws that we have. I would ask folks are very welcome to have questions, but if you can hold them to the end of each presentation, that would be fantastic. And then at the end of both, we'll group up for a roundtable discussion before voting on the approval of those documents. So thank you, Lisa.
Okay, I got it fixed so that I can have side-by-side view of my talking points and the presentation that you all are looking at. Again, I'm Lisa on the Council Central staff. I'm going to be quickly walking you through the draft work program that would lead to a set of recommendations from this group to the City Council by July 31st on ways to enhance the capacity of the Office of the City Auditor to conduct performance audits. So you've seen that was language directly out of the resolution. The next slide that you're going to see is going to be way too busy for the size of the screen probably, but this is the document that you saw with your meeting materials, the draft scope of work and schedule. So we'll just go ahead and move on to the next slide if we may. So for my overview today, I'm just going to show you how the suggested sequence of the committee's work plan would lead you to develop the final recommendations report. The format that I used in putting together the draft schedule is really kind of a project management type critical path schedule that will include some key milestones. So if we could have the next slide there. The key milestones that are applicable for this kind of work are really developing your committee rules, which you're going to be talking about today in terms of the bylaws. A series of briefings and discussions that will get everybody on the same page for some background and be able to tap into the amazing font of knowledge we have from the committee members here. So that's going to really help inform each other and set the direction for these recommendations. There will be a series of decisions made in May and June that will be the building blocks for your final report. And then in June and July, you'll be looking at drafts and ultimately approving a final recommendations report. So if we could go to the next slide, Parker, thank you. So the briefing, so in terms of what you're going to be doing for briefings and discussions, today you're going to be hearing the overviews from the Office of City Auditor and Inspector General. Moving into May, you'll hear both a combination of briefings and discussion at your first meeting in May. We'll share a background report with you that I think Parker may have sent out that compares Seattle's audit practices with those of King County and 3 comparably sized cities in the United States. Then I think of incredible value, we're going to be hearing from you, from your perspective on the benefits and challenges of performance audits, how you see consultants being incorporated into this area of work, and from your experience, what you've seen as best practices or well-regarded programs with which you're familiar. So we'll go ahead to the next slide, if you will. After you've had all those briefings and kind of incorporated in some of your meetings, you'll see that the second meeting in May, you're going to continue the discussion on building on the background you've had that will help formulate a draft issue identification paper. So what are the issues facing the city's auditor's office relative to performance audits? What sorts of things should be considered? So you'll be talking about those potential areas of improvement, any considerations that might affect how those areas might be addressed. So you might think that, you know, using the San Francisco model of auditing every department on a rotating cycle is great. On the other hand, they have an incredible amount of money that they donate to, or that they dedicate to doing that. Then at your first meeting in June, the committee will review and discuss a draft issue identification paper that builds from those discussions. And that'll set the stage then for a decision process where you'll do an initial prioritization of recommended improvements. So that segues us to the next slide, which is talking about what decisions we'll be asking you to make. Let me get my talking points up to speed here. So you're basically going to be making 3 kind of areas of key decisions. You're going to be prioritizing, doing this initial prioritization of improvements that you've brainstormed, probably modified or informed by implementation feasibility. You will have an initial set of recommendations out of that that will help shape a draft report that I'll put together for you. You'll look at the draft report and you'll give edits, and we can do that in 1 or 2 cycles depending on the timing and how we move along in the committee. Ultimately, then you would be asked to approve a final report by July 31st that would then get presented to the council. So you'll notice on the schedule that was sent out, we basically have the meetings identified as 2 meetings a month in May, June, and July. 1 meeting obviously this month. We don't have the dates actually set, and Parker and Councilmember Lewis are going to be working on that with you to make sure that we can have give you a heads up on when those meetings will be. So Councilmember Lewis, that completes my presentation on the schedule and scope. I can move right into the bylaws if you like, or take questions now as you see fit.
Thank you, Lisa. Why don't we pause here for a second to see if there's any questions in terms of facilitating this. If folks can, because I can look at everybody in the gallery here. If folks have a question, they can raise their hand and I can give them the floor. Otherwise, if people just want to, for folks that are just on the phone without video image, I guess if you just want to speak up now, that's fine too. But if there's questions, I think on this initial presentation, we can stop and take those now. Okay, Robert, did you have a question?
Yeah, I think I heard that it was Parker who was going to be sending out a number of meeting invitations through Zoom so we can get them on our calendars.
Parker, you want to jump in on that? I think that was going to be the plan, that I was going to work with Parker and Lisa to kind of set up when the meetings would be. But Parker, can you maybe share a little bit more about the process?
Absolutely. And thank you, Robert, for that question. So this afternoon, after we depart from this meeting, I'll be sending out a pretty hefty doodle poll as I sent to schedule this meeting. Luckily we'll be looking out a couple of whole months. So hopefully we'll have a couple of options that we can use to make sure that we can get each meeting scheduled well enough in advance so that folks can get those supplemental materials to them, have time to review any documents that they wanted to beforehand, and have any questions answered by myself or Lisa. But yeah, in terms of scheduling upcoming meetings, you'll be getting an email this afternoon after our meeting.
Okay, awesome. Are there any additional questions on Lisa Kay's initial outline before we go on to the next part? Okay, great. So Lisa, why don't you continue along to the next part of your presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, for the record, I'm Lisa Kay, still with the Council Central staff. So now I'm going to briefly walk you through each of the 7 sections of the draft bylaws that were included with your meeting materials. Let's go to the next slide, please, Parker. Okay, so this one, section 1 basically describes the authority under which the committee exists and how it was created, referencing Resolution 31941 that the City Council adopted on April 6th. That was included in your with your meeting materials. Section 2 goes on and has a series of definitions, basically identifying that the committee that is formed is the same thing that was created, same entity that was created in the resolution with a slightly different name. Defines for the purposes of the general public what a performance audit is, and then has a definition of consensus. This came from a publication out of the Public Disputes Program at Harvard Law School, where consensus is defined as overwhelming agreement that goes as far as possible toward meeting the interests of all stakeholders. So that's key to keep in mind as we talk about the decision-making process. That would be basically the threshold by which consensus would be evaluated, whether you've reached that or not. Moving to section 3, the next slide, please, describes the purpose of the committee, which is, as we mentioned before, to identify recommendations to strengthen the performance audit function of the Office of City Auditor. The committee is to report to the City Council by July 31st of 2020. And as spelled out in the resolution, the committee is to review opportunities and challenges as identified in that resolution. Move to the next slide, please, Parker. Section 4 is going to has a number of subsections that I'll go through one by one. So let's go to the next slide now. For membership, the committee is comprised of 9 members as established per that resolution. You'll see in the bylaws that we're proposing that members can designate an alternate to attend a maximum of 2 meetings in your place. There's also provision in this subsection to allow the invitation of non-voting guests to participate in a particular meeting. Those requests need to be made 10 business days in advance of the meeting, and that would be subject to the committee chair's approval. Moving to the next slide, subsection on appointments and terms of office. Your appointment was obviously effective as soon as you were appointed, which was Monday of this week, I believe. You have been asked to serve until the committee reports its recommendations on July 31st, 2020. If vacancies should arise, the council has the option to fill those vacancies. That's basically that subsection. The next subsection in this area speaks to conflicts of interest. This is standard language that basically says that members are responsible for identifying potential conflicts of interest or appearance of fairness problems and recusing themselves from deliberation and decision-making on that specific matter. That doesn't mean that you would be asked to recuse yourself from all of the committee's deliberations, just a particular matter. And it will be relying on individuals to make that judgment call. Moving to the next section, removal from office. Members serve at the pleasure of the City Council. If you've got 3 absences or more, you might be recommended to be removed, as we are hoping to have a continuity of knowledge and information base, as we have a pretty compressed timeline to come up with these recommendations. Moving then to section 5, the officers for the committee are a chair and a vice chair. The City Council appointed Councilmember Lewis to be the chair, and then this committee would select its own vice chair. Section 6 goes into a series of rules of procedure. So as specified in the resolution, the committee will meet at least once a month. As you heard, we're anticipating you'll meet more like two times a month, possibly more if needed. But this work program is one that you saw, makes it look like we could get by with 2 meetings a month. So we will continue to meet remotely until the City Council resumes in-person meetings. We don't know quite when that will be. I don't think it will be in May. When we do begin to meet in person again, out-of-area members are allowed to participate remotely according to this draft of the bylaws. Moving then to decision-making. A quorum for doing business, for the meeting to do business, is 50% plus 1 member. Decisions will be made by consensus or majority vote. As you heard, we've proposed a definition of consensus that you heard was overwhelming agreement that goes as far as possible toward meeting the interests of all stakeholders. Upon request, an individual in the minority on the decision can request of the chair that those opinions are recorded in meeting summaries and in final recommendations. Looking at another subsection of section 6, the public access and records. Meetings will be accessible to the public. So as Parker mentioned, we do have a couple members, I believe, of the public on the line who are able to listen into the meeting. That's been advertised widely and is posted on the city's website. So trying to make this as accessible as possible for people who want to listen in. Recordings of the meeting will be made available to the public. We will at the same time be asking the committee to approve meeting notes each week or each meeting, so that we have a corrected record of business. And then because you are doing city business, committee members are required to forward any of your records relating to this business, to this committee's business, to the city staff, and that would be to Councilmember Lewis's office for retention. I believe Parker has been in communication with you, or will be, about what is involved in doing that. We have some guidelines put forward by our records manager in the legislative department that can help with that. Okay, and as you heard, rules of procedure for staffing. Councilmember Lewis's office will be providing administrative and technical support, and central staff, right now in the person of me, who will be providing you briefing materials and draft and final reports for your approval. Section 7 just says that if you want to amend these bylaws, you would submit, after they're approved, you would submit the proposed amendments at a regularly scheduled meeting, and they would be taken up at the subsequent meeting, not the same meeting at which they were proposed. And that completes my overview of the draft bylaws for your consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So does anybody have any feedback on those bylaws as presented at this stage, or any questions for Lisa about some of the details before we move on from the bylaws discussion?
I do.
Please go ahead.
This is this is why I was often referred to as a picky auditor when I was the auditor, but I did find, at least on the last version that I received, a couple of typos in section 5 and one in section 6, and I'll just send those to you.
Thank you.
They're tiny. They're tiny.
Okay, great. Do we have any other comments or questions relating to the presentation on the bylaws?
Seems reasonable.
Yes.
Okay, great. So now that we've gone over that, I think we can jump into the scope of work discussion. So, you know, I'll start with maybe a couple comments, and then I'll turn it over to Parker and Lisa and maybe even our auditors as well. But I think, okay, there we go. Perfect. Thanks for bringing that up, Parker, the slide relating to the schedule. So, yeah, there were certain things enumerated in the resolution that the council passed that was sent out as one of the materials for the meeting. You know, first, you know, the things that this committee is going to look at are, you know, the benefits, just sort of generally of, you know, of performance auditing, and some of the ways that we can maximize those benefits. And some of those were touched on in the presentations of various members. So, you know, driving efficiency in city government, driving effectiveness in how we're implementing city services, considerations for how auditing can drive equity. And, you know, David has a lot of good examples of work the city has done to do that and how we can build on and expand those kind of equitable considerations. You know, one thing that's going to be increasingly relevant, I think, to my colleagues going forward here will be, you know, the maximizing of revenue and savings potentially from performance auditing, like how performance auditing can help us drive ways to, as a government, save money and make sure that we are getting the best return for taxpayers. Innovation. Like how can performance audits make sure that we are using the right technology, making the right kind of investments, doing things that have the potential to really innovate and change how we're delivering services in a way that can be more effective and have more value. The second area enumerated in the resolution, maximizing the use of consultant contracts. The city council very commonly will attach mandates that outside consultants be secured to do some additional work in auditing or following up on particular pieces of legislation, making sure we look at that practice relative to what our peer groups do, not just to inform how the auditor's office interfaces with consultants, but also when we as a council are putting in a mandate like that, how are we structuring it in a way to help inform the work of the auditor and derive the best benefit. And then the third category, just talking about best practices in the auditing, in performance auditing, just how the systems that we have in Seattle stack up relative to what other jurisdictions are doing. And there's a whole bunch of subcategories of the best practices discussion that are sort of enumerated at that part of the resolution. And then finally, whatever we kind of decide on that would be good or something to pursue, a conversation about capacity and resources. Lisa touched on this a little bit in her presentation that, there might be some really attractive models that have big kind of robust and comprehensive scopes of performance auditing, but that come with a much bigger price tag than what the city of Seattle currently is putting into the Inspector General and the Office of the Auditor. So how do we make sure that we're kind of squaring our recommendations with capacity and resources and being really intentional about putting together the reforms we're requesting with the amount of resources that would be required to actually implement things like that. So that's just my brief overview of scope as laid out in the resolution. Lisa has put together this proposed schedule that kind of breaks those things out into the discussions over the subsequent meetings. So I figured I would maybe turn it over at this point to Lisa to maybe talk a little bit more here. If there's anything I missed in talking about scope and how we're going to approach it in this plan that's been, the schedule that's been put out here.
Thank you, Councilmember Lewis. I think you went over it pretty well, and I think what's, to some extent, the pace of the group will be set once we start diving into some of these issues. And so, as I mentioned, the huge value of having this group is the collective hive mind, if you will, of people who've been working in this field for so long. So as we begin to talk about benefits and challenges and issue identification and possible ways to move forward, we will be, pivoting in terms of time commitments and how quickly we can turn documents around, basically in response to what we're hearing from the group. It's the calendar, I guess the schedule, I wouldn't say the schedule is an absolute best case. It does build in some slack, but it is still a pretty ambitious pace to maintain to get to these recommendations. But I think it's doable. I didn't have too much more to add on that, Councilmember, unless you had specific directions or specific questions you wanted me to speak to.
No, I think unless other folks have questions now, like either for myself or central staff or for Parker, I think we could open it up to that before we move on from the scope discussion and approve the bylaws, which would be the next thing on the agenda. I want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for Lisa and David to give kind of an overview of their departments, and then maybe we can wrap up this initial meeting even a little bit early today. Based on the pace that we're going along. I'll just throw it out there though real quick to see if there's any questions on the scope discussion. Lisa, Judge, do you have a question on the scope?
I don't have a question, Councilmember. I just wanted to add a little something in and to amplify that. I think one of the values we really need to push forward is the ability of audits and reports to enhance transparency of government processes and to make those accessible to community. So I would just like to, say that out loud and make sure that's something that we're really taking into account.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with that. Given the audits I've seen come out of city government from my brief time on the city council so far, there's definitely been a big transparency promoting component to those audits in terms of the information they've uncovered. Even though that's not explicitly mentioned, I do think it's between the lines in a lot of the categories that I did bring up.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that there would be any problem and this for Lisa K, I guess, is a question. I don't think there'd be any problem with maybe just explicitly putting down transparency of government functions as one of the benefits for that kind of first part of the scope, benefits of performance auditing, and something that's fair game for us to consider. Even though it wasn't in the authorizing resolution, I think it's broad enough to accommodate our consideration of that. Lisa K, what do you think?
Oh, I completely agree. And there can be some conversation too about how other agencies are able to extend that transparency or maybe get a higher profile on some of their findings. So there's ways to do that also. And it certainly fits within the discussion of benefits and challenges. I agree with you.
I would definitely support you including transparency as one of the overarching goals of the auditor's office in this process.
And accountability.
And accountability.
This is Estella Ortega. So in mentioning transparency, can we assume that also would include assessing community involvement?
Say a little bit more about that, Ms. Stella, just like in terms of making sure that there's like kind of broader consultation when we're doing things like this.
Right. When, I'm going to take the example that was given to me around, the sugary tax, and the assumption there was to assume, the hope was that individuals, in particular in low income and communities of color, would would buy less soda. But what's turned out is that they're buying more soda, and there's more money into the pot. And I don't know if that, I vaguely remember some articles, but that was because it came out of, the media, but not necessarily that it came out of government, and that analysis was broadly, given to community. And then what do we do about that? So I think that if information was made transparent to community, there could be probably some creative options on what to do about it, as an example.
I think that's a really good consideration, that like the transparency considerations also kind of go to communication too, right? And like also collaboration and partnership. So I think that, I think the overall consensus here is that we definitely should make sure transparency is an explicit part of the scope under like that kind of benefit prong. And I don't think there's any opposition from anyone on the group here about making sure that's incorporated.
Right.
Unless I
guess I would add is that, again, I guess I would have to look at the legislation closer together. The fact that we know that the audit office is utilizing the Race and Social Justice Initiative. Has there been any analysis to that in terms of how it's working, community input, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. No, that's perfect. And that'll touch on some of the like the equity considerations too. So I think there's a lot of overlap with those, and that'll be a big part of the work that we do. So I think that's perfect.
Thank you.
The feedback from Estella and Lisa Judge on transparency, I think we should incorporate that into the scope. Is there any other feedback on the scope conversation before we move on to approving the bylaws? Lisa Kay.
I would just suggest that there might be a good nexus between this conversation and the bylaws, that the committee has the authority to amend to revise these bylaws before adopting them, and there may be a place in the purpose section. I can see a couple places where you might want to add reference to transparency. Equity is called out, but there's certainly room to be able to elaborate on that. So as we talk about the bylaws, we can look at whether there's some language that you'd like to add in section 3.
Sure. I could, so would it be appropriate at this time then, Lisa, just as, I guess, a parliamentary question for me to move to officially add transparency to that list as one of the considerations?
Certainly.
All right, so I think I'm going to formally move that we add transparency as one of the benefits, the scope benefits that we're going to look into examining. So is there a second for that motion?
I'd be happy to second that, Councilmember Lisa Judge.
Okay. Great, thank you. So there is a second. Is there anybody? Well, I guess I would say this. And for the folks that are on call only, no picture, I'll separately call to make sure that your vote is counted in adding transparency. But I think I would just ask for the folks first that are on TV, if you're in favor of adding transparency, signify by raising your hand. Okay, great. And then for those who are on the call, and I think it's only Estella who's only on the phone. I guess I'll call. I'll just ask Estella. Do you also affirm adding transparency as one of the, in the official vote as adding transparency to the scope.
In agreement.
Excellent. Okay, there we go. So having heard no one in opposition and I think unanimously of the people that are present, I think the motion carries unanimously from the members of the committee. So I would just ask that central staff add transparency to that list of things to be considered in the scope of work of the committee.
We'll do that. I will do that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, are there any other considerations on scope before we move to ratifying the bylaws?
Just,
Yes, Cheryl.
well, just a brief comment that I think you mentioned, or maybe Lisa did, that this is could be ambitious. And when I think about what typically we auditors and evaluators are involved in, we are going to be trying to meet a scope of work that is pretty ambitious for coming up with substantive recommendations that we do feel can make a difference by July. So I'll be interested in how we first develop our criteria and the usual things that evaluators do.
Well, fortunately, I think we do have some flexibility in requesting more time, from the council if we wanted to take longer. So, that is a consideration that, we can certainly ask for more time if we're in a good place and think we need to do a little more work to kind of round it out. So, but that's, I agree. I think it is a tight timeline and it's an ambitious scope of work. So, I appreciate that comment. And Levon, did you also have a comment?
Well, this may be premature to ask this question, but I have been in my reading of the materials and then also in a couple of things that were said today. I guess I would like to know more details about why the office needs to strengthen performance auditing function, because that's been said a couple of times or has been included in some of the, and maybe that David will talk about that.
Right. I don't think it's a matter of implying that, I guess I'll just say from the outset in terms of some of my intent behind this and convening this group together, this isn't to imply that there's anything wrong with the auditing work being done with the City of Seattle. I think that auditing work being produced is exceptional and very impactful. And I've seen a lot of evidence of that just in my first couple of months in the audits that David's office has released. I think that though that it's been a while since the council has kind of come in to sort of take a look at how we might be able to protect and expand that function in a way that can make auditing a bigger part of what we're doing as a legislative branch in the City of Seattle. So yeah, it's less about like we're looking for there's like a problem that needs to be fixed. It's more about there might be some ways that we can kick it up even more and expand. So that was a good thing to clarify. Thanks for bringing that up. Are there any other comments on scope or questions before we move on to the bylaw approval?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Lisa.
Might I suggest that in light of, I think it was Ms. Broom's suggestion or question about what kind of criteria will the group be using, I might suggest that at your May 2nd meeting, I don't know how formally you want to make amendments to the scope of work, I guess, but at least in my note taking, I made notes that we might want to propose and have the committee adopt some criteria for how they would prioritize improvements before we ask them to actually do the prioritization. So I could add that work item to the second meeting in May if that is to the committee's liking.
We could do that at least to have the option. I think if we add it now, if it looks like it's less essential, we could take it out later. But I don't think there's anything wrong with incorporating that into the work plan.
Okay.
Okay, so why don't we move on to the bylaw discussion? It doesn't sound like anyone has anything else to add to the bylaws, unless there's any final contributions. All right, well, so with that, I guess I would just call the question to approve the bylaws. And so is there a second?
Second.
All right. So then if all those in favor of approving the bylaws, and I think everyone now is on video, signify by raising your hand. Okay, there's a unanimous decision to approve the bylaws. It's the opinion of the chair, seeing that every member affirmatively raised their hand that the bylaws are approved. And we will move forward in accordance with those established bylaws. Okay, so at this point then, I'm going to hand it over first to David Jones to give an overview of the Office of City Auditor. And then we'll maybe take questions from David and then move on and get an overview of the Office of the Inspector General and take questions from Lisa. And we might be able to finish 10 to 15 minutes early today. So why don't we turn it over to David Jones. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Okay. And thank you, Parker, for operating the slides. Again, Parker, if you could go to the next slide, please. Slide 2. Thank you. So I've been asked to talk about 6 things with you today, and as you can see them, I won't read this list, but sort of basic things about our office. And I hope you enjoy the lovely picture of the Space Needle on Mount Rainier.
Nice.
Parker, could you go on to slide 3, please? So just a little bit of background history about our office, and that's we have a member or two who are different, but that's pretty much the cast of characters you see, and I'm very proud to work with all of those folks. Our office was established in 1991, and it was established by the voters of Seattle. They decided to approve a change to the city charter. Now, the city charter is equivalent to the U.S. Constitution. It's probably the preeminent legal document governing the government of the city of Seattle. So this is a big deal. And my understanding back then is the reason why they decided to do that, the council, is because they wanted to establish a vigorous performance auditing function. And prior to that, I think there was a perception that they didn't have one. So, and as spelled out in the charter and then enumerated in the Seattle Municipal Code, that the auditor's term is for 4 years. And as I said before, I'm on my 3rd term. The city auditor can be removed before the end of his or her term by a majority vote of the city council. It is interesting to note when the city auditor's position was first started, that person, she had a 6-year term. And then sometimes in the mid to late 90s, I believe it was, the city council decided to change it to a 4-year term to match that of council members' terms. The work plan decisions, and I know this is probably of great interest to this group. Basically, it's ultimately to the city auditor to decide what the office should work on. But I want to caveat that. If you look in the Seattle Municipal Code, it's chapter 3.40, and in that chapter, it spells out a whole bunch of things the city auditor can do. But before this list of things the city auditor can do, there's a sentence, a lead-in sentence, and there's a clause within that sentence that says, the city auditor can do all this stuff under the direction of the city council. And what I and my 2 predecessors, Nora Masters and Susan Cohen, have interpreted that to mean is, and this is equivalent to what the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, does, we pay highest priority to requests for work from the city council. So that's kind of how we've interpreted that language in the Seattle Municipal Code. And we do have a list which I can share with you. Kind of and this is again equivalent to what GAO does with congressional requests. I have sort of a hierarchy of things that how we consider requests. Like obviously the biggest one is if a law is passed by the council, an ordinance directing us to do something, that's going to be way up there in the list. So but ultimately it's just a city auditor, giving deference to what the council requests. And again, our budget, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's a little over $2.5 million for 2020. I do want to point out that a chunk of that, a significant chunk, $500,000, is money we were given to by the council, and the council and ordinance said, we want you to use that money, go out and pick somebody to evaluate the sweetened beverage tax ordinance. So that money kind of passed, we did that. But that money is sort of fixed, on how it can be used. And we contracted with Public Health Seattle King County to lead that evaluation. And that evaluation is their product. We kind of administer the contract on behalf of the city. Parker, could you go to the next slide, please? So what's our role in the city? I mean, what do we do? And really, there are two main things we do. We act as a watchdog. And I realize we should have a dog on here, but it's actually on the next slide. You'll see a bulldog. But we have a watchdog function. We're making sure that the right things are done and calling it out when things are not being done correctly. But I'm very proud of our office. We're also an advocate for good government. And what that means is we spend a lot of time not just criticizing, being armchair quarterbacks, but we also think about, well, gee, how can we improve city government? It's much easier to criticize something. I think it's a much more difficult intellectual exercise to go through and figure out how can we make things better. So one of the things we do, we make a lot of recommendations, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on in my presentation. But we have three bodies of work, main bodies of work that we do to do our work. And you'll see they're listed there, performance audits, which you talked about. And these are distinguished from those of you who aren't that familiar with that term, but I know most of you are. There's another type of audit, a financial audit, but that's looking at accounting records, debits and credits and whatnot, do they line up? Performance audits, when you're looking at the efficiency, the effectiveness, and the equity of city programs that are being done by the city of Seattle in our case. And basically all you do with a performance audit is you find some standards, some criteria, and then you look at the program or function and you compare it to that standard. It's like kind of comparing the ideal to reality. And you look at those two things, and then the next step in the exercise is, well, gee, why is there a difference? And then the next step is, does the difference is it a big deal? Who cares? And so that's kind of the exercise you go through in a performance audit, is assessing something against a set of standards. The other thing we do is, that I mentioned this before, we follow up on our recommendations. We make a lot of recommendations, and what we do every year is we do a report, and we follow up on that report to the council and the public on whether or not they've been implemented. And I think this is really important because we're not going to go away. Because we don't have the legal authority to direct departments to do what we recommend, but we do have the power of persuasion and the ability to bird dog it, to keep following up on that. And then finally, the last thing we do, program evaluations, and I had mentioned that before. Council about 10 years ago just asked us to get more involved in program evaluations, which are very rigorous evaluations to see if a particular public policy intervention led to a change. And the two examples we have are the secure scheduling ordinance and the sweetened beverage tax ordinance. And in both cases, the council gave us a pot of money and said, go pick somebody to do these evaluations to see if these laws actually made a difference. And just these type of evaluations require a great subject matter expertise. Like you're talking about PhDs in a certain area, and also an army of grad students to help them do the research. They're really quite resource intensive. But the council wanted us to get involved in that, to oversee that. And also, I think they liked it because, it gave more of an appearance of independence, that it wasn't the council hiring these consultants to look at whether or not the laws had an effect, but, an outside party more separate from the council. So if you could move on to the next slide, please, Parker, that would be great. So authority and scope, what gives us our authority? I think I've already referred to that again, the Seattle City Charter and the Seattle Municipal Code. And what do these things allow us to do? Well, basically we could look at anything the city spends money We have access to all City of Seattle employees. We can go talk to them, meet with them. They have to be made available to us, and all records that are produced by city departments. So we, and I should clarify one thing. What we're allowed to look at includes public development authorities like the Pike Place Market Preservation Development Authority and other PDAs as they're referred to. And we've actually done a couple of reports on those. And we could also look at certain functions of the city's judicial branch, the Seattle Municipal Court. Now, what we don't do is we don't second guess the judge's decisions, but we can look at the programs and operations of the court. In fact, right now, Council President Gonzalez and asked us to look at, and actually this was passed through a city council statement of legislative request, I believe, that we should look at the Seattle Municipal Court's probation function. So that's something we're doing right now, looking at their probation program. If you could move the next slide, please. So what standards do we follow in doing our work? Well, we do our work in accordance with what's called the U.S. Government Auditing Standards, and they're popularly referred to as the Yellow Book. It's a set of standards for audits, financial and performance audits that are put up by the Comptroller General of the United States. That's the head of the USGAO, the Government Accountability Office, the office that audits on behalf of the Congress, that basically oversees the executive branch. And what these standards basically do, and it's not scintillating reading by any means, but it's necessary. It talks about you have to get lots of evidence in order to make an audit finding, and you have to have a really good system of quality control in order to make sure that what you come up with, your findings and recommendations, are accurate and comprehensive. And then one of the other things in the Yellow Book I'll just draw your attention to is every 3 years you need to have some independent external auditors come in and look at your office and evaluate whether or not you're following these standards, whether or not you have system in place to ensure that you are following the Yellow Book, the government auditing standards. And since I've become city auditor, we've had this done 3 times by the Association of Local Government Auditors, ALGA. And I'm pleased to note that we passed 3 times, and those reports are available on our website. Parker, and one other thing, just to brag about the office, because I'm so proud of what people have done in our office. We have received several awards from the Association of Local Government Auditors on the quality of our reports. They give out an award called the Knighton Award every year, and we've collected a few awards for that. So I'm very proud of our folks for doing that. If you could move on to the next slide, please. So here, I talked about this. This just gives you an idea of I think what is probably the best metric for judging, or one of the best metrics for judging the performance of our office. And this shows you that since 2007 through 2019, we've made over 700 recommendations in our audit reports. And this is this donut here that you see. The green part, most of them have been implemented by our departments. You know, we go back and do our annual audit recommendation follow-up process, and we'll go see, have they implemented what we said? And as you can see, most of them have been implemented. There's the yellow slice or the orange slice there. There are a number that are still at play. The departments are still working on them, because some of the recommendations we make actually take quite a while for some departments to get to fully implement. And then there's some, that red slice, that were not implemented. And I should say very few of those ones that were implemented are due to a department just saying, no, we're not going to do it. Most of those are because conditions have changed, like the program no longer exists, or just something changed that it's no longer possible to implement that recommendation. So if you could go to the next slide, please. And I think this is just to show you, the range of time, and what I draw your attention to is, most the earlier years, most of the stuff is green, but as you go on in time, you see you have the more yellow stuff, more stuff that's pending. But I think you can see, it's a number of recommendations every year, quite a few, and we really spend a lot of time and effort following up on those recommendations to make sure that that they get done, because you could just make a recommendation and talk is cheap, right? And unless you follow up and see what's being done, you're kind of, you may not have any effect. Could you go to the next slide, please? I was asked to talk about our budget. This is our budget from the last 2 years, 2019, 2020. And I'll just draw your attention to one thing. yeah, as you could see, one thing is, most of our money is spent on our staff. And I want to draw your attention to one year. You'll see in 2019, 57% of our budget was spent on staff. But then you go to 2020 and you see 71% is spent on our staff. And the reason why you have that jump is because that consultant work category down there, that's really the money that council, most of that, the vast majority is money that council has given us and directed us to spend on those program evaluations I talked to about the sweetened beverage tax and the secure scheduling legislation. And in 2020, the money for the secure scheduling legislation disappears, and there's less money being spent on the sweetened beverage tax. So you can see now, 71% of that spending goes towards our personnel expenses. If you could go to the next slide, please, Parker, that would be a great thing. I was asked to talk about our work plan, and what this shows you is the audits that we've completed in 2020 and the ones we're working on right now. The point I would like to have you draw from this, but I think you could draw from this, is we do a work in a lot of areas. You can see we looked at human services departments, homeless contracting, how well they manage that. We looked at Seattle City Light billing. There was a big kerfluffle about people were getting unexpectedly high bills. So we, at the request of Councilmember Mosqueda, and with the support of current Utilities City Council Chair Alex Peterson, did that work and came up with a lot of recommendations. We also looked at the fourth thing, the navigation team. We spent quite a bit of effort, time and effort, looking at how the city is dealing with homelessness. And the navigation team, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's an entity the city created, a group to deal with unsanctioned encampments of unsheltered individuals. And in this particular report, we were actually looking at trash accumulations and how the city was dealing with that around those encampments. And then numbers 5 through 10 are ongoing audits, looking at city light, non-police surveillance technologies. We actually there's an ordinance passed about surveillance technologies. Our office looks at all the stuff the police department doesn't have. And Lisa's office, Lisa Judge, looks at all the police department surveillance technologies. And it just so happens that the first two that sort of kicked out of the process that the legislation requires are two ones that our office is going to look at involving the Seattle Department of Transportation. As I said, we're looking at municipal court, a navigation team, IT equipment, loss reports. And then number 10 is something we just were asked to do by Councilmember Alex Peterson, who's chair of the Council's Transportation Committee, in the wake of the failure of the West Seattle Bridge, or they closed the West Seattle Bridge. It's probably has the most traffic in Seattle, I believe, or close to it. And there's some very disturbing cracks that our Department of Transportation found were occurring in the bridge. So they closed it. And in the wake of that, Councilmember Peterson said, gee, could you guys look and see how much money and how many inspections the city is doing of the other bridges in Seattle? And then the last thing I'll mention, business taxes. Council President Gonzalez and Councilmember Mosqueda asked us to look at how well was the city collecting business taxes. And this was actually we had done this audit years ago, and they wanted us to go look at this again, and I thought it was a great idea. We've had to pause that audit because of COVID-19, basically. The staff that we would have been working with to audit are so subsumed in dealing with COVID-19 and so affected by it that it just didn't make sense for us to try and work with them to do an audit. If you could go to the next slide, please, Parker. And again, these are some of our non-audit projects. I've already talked about the two in the middle. Those are program evaluations of the sweetened beverage tax and the secure scheduling ordinance. We also, the top one there, it's some statistical reports. They're not a ton of work to put together. We're getting stats on gun deaths and gun injuries from the State Department of Health and Public Health Seattle and King County, and putting that together in a little statistical report. We'll be doing that for a couple years. The last thing on there, I hadn't mentioned this before, and I'm very proud of this. We've been doing a lot of work. Our office really played a key role in securing, getting some federal grants from the National Institution of Justice and Department of Justice to look at ways to reduce youth violence in Rainier Beach. and keep kids out of the criminal justice system. Because I know, as many of you probably know, once you get a youth involved in the criminal justice system, the research just leads to a lot of bad outcomes. And the more we can do to prevent and keep youth from entering that cycle, the better it is for them. So we've been working with a variety of community and city partners and George Mason University to set up a program. The current one is the Positive Behavioral Interventions and Support Program, which is basically a way of looking at it as like catch them when they're doing good things. You know how when you're raising your kids, like don't just focus on what they're doing bad, focus on what positive things they're doing. So we've had a big role in that. I'm very proud of that. So Parker, can you go last slide? I think that's the last slide. Yeah, so that is a very quick overview of what our office does. I did leave out one thing, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Really, what we do is we focus on implementation. The city council will pass a budget or pass a law. And what happens after they do that? After they pass their budget, after they pass that law, what happens to that money? What happens to that law? Is the law being followed? Is it effective? Is it well thought out? What's happening to that money? And that's where we really help the council in their oversight role. I think we play a really key role in doing that. That's it. I'll be quiet now and turn it over to whoever else is taking over now. But thank you for your patience and listening. And again, if you have any questions about what we do, please let me know, and I'd be delighted to answer the question.
Yeah, David, thank you so much for that presentation. So why don't we take a minute here if folks have any questions based on David's presentation that they want to field to him before we move on to the Inspector General.
Hi, this is Estella.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I do have a couple of questions. One, I was interested in what are sort of some of the elements of why so many, I don't know what percentage of the audits that are pending and how many that means, because, there's a big yellow bar that says pending. And so what are the elements of why they're still pending?
The best and the details to that you can find by, we just issued our annual report that covers audit recommendations made that were still alive, that were still open through 2019. And that, to answer your question, it could be a variety of things. It could be like the department has to go through a laborious process in order to select. We recommend it. Let's, for example, they need new software because they're just using manual records and it's really inefficient. And so they have to go through a process to actually procure the software, the automated system, and then implement it. And so we're not going to close it until they do that and implement it. And that can often, if you're familiar with the way information technology projects happen in the city, that can often take a really long time. So there are really a variety of answers for that, but I would, and I could send you or direct you to our report and, sort of give you specific examples of why something would be pending.
Okay, and then my last question is, and I don't know if it's the appropriate time or if it should be later in our meetings in May, but I was curious to know how the Race and Social Justice Initiative Toolkit is utilized within audits.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I'd love to talk to you in more detail, and we can have further conversations about this because I think it's so important. And I'll credit a lot of the credit in our office should go to Virginia Garcia, who's been our lead in our office. Virginia really developed a form. Well, the way we implement it in our office is every time we start an audit, we have this form that reminds us to think through what are the RSJ, the Race and Social Justice Initiative implications of the topics that we maybe could talk on. Just remind us, let's think about that and see if we can take that angle in doing whatever audit we've been asked to do. And so we sit down as an office and try and think that through. I will say our toolkit is a little different from the one most city departments use because most city departments have outward facing community programs, where they're providing services or directly to the community, and we're mostly reporting to the city council and to the residents of Seattle on city programs. So we're not going out in the community necessarily and implementing a program, but we do in some of our reports. Like we recently looked at the city's enforcement of the minimum wage law, and one of the things we looked at is how well the Office of Labor Standards was contracting with community groups, involving community groups in their work. So we do touch on that. But again, that's very important to us to have that tool. And we're proud. I think we were one of the first people to really use that tool regularly that I'm aware of at the local government, performance audit level. And, so it's kind of institutionalized in our office, but we're always looking for ways to improve it. And if you would like more details, Virginia, Ms. Garcia can come and talk to you about it. She really has quite a bit of knowledge. And actually, Virginia was also on our National Association until recently, was head of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. So Virginia really, I wanted her to get involved in that, and she eagerly agreed, because we need to spread this throughout the performance auditing profession. And it's so important to take equity into consideration. Auditors traditionally just look at efficiency and effectiveness, but equity, is such a part of what government should be about, particularly nowadays. So, at any rate, I should shut myself up, because I think it's a fascinating topic and one that we should be continually improving on. And again, if you'd like further information, I think from our office, Virginia would really be able to give you the best information about that. But great question. Thanks for asking it.
I would like that. And so that would be great. And I just want to say that, the list of work that you have to do in terms of so many different entities that you're auditing is impressive, especially the fact that you don't have a huge staff. I look at those projects and I think, oh my God, there's so many different elements of that. And so I just want to acknowledge that.
Thank you. And I wake up every day thanking whoever's in charge of things for allowing me to work with the folks I do. And we have a very, very experienced set of auditors in our office. And I'll be open with you. One of the things I worried about is succession planning. Either when I go or whoever takes over, we have so much experience. So that's one of the challenges. Just to give you a preview of if you want to know from me that I'm concerned about. And I think that's through a lot of government, actually, that you kind of have this one demographic, a lot of people who may be moving on. And what are you going to do to replace that, that institutional knowledge? So.
I'd just like to say that I'm glad to see you still doing this work, David. I don't know if you remember, but you were the lead on the peer review. Can't remember what year, but the very first one that I participated in. I learned a lot from you.
Well, I thank you, and I learned a lot. That was one of the great things about peer reviews. You go to another sister agency office, and you learn a lot from them, and you steal their good ideas. And we won't talk about the year I was there, because that'd date both of us, horribly. But at any rate, thanks. It's great to see you again.
Okay, are there any other final questions for David before we move on to the Inspector General's presentation?
I'd just like to make a comment, if I may.
Of course.
Yeah,
and then I think Cheryl also raised her hand too. So so go ahead, and we'll get through those, and then we'll move on.
Okay. Well, just David, you did a great job describing what your office does, and one of the things that struck me was when you were describing what a performance audit is, and you mentioned that, well, you're looking at some operation or agency or something that government does, and you're trying to find some standards or criteria on which to evaluate it. So I'm just making a comment, is that it's an extremely sometimes difficult thing to do, is to find the right kind of standard, the right things to think about. And getting back to the racial and social justice issue comments, including that as an explicit consideration when you're embarking on a performance audit, that's one example of the kinds of things that thinking about things that kind of help you think outside the box, because years ago or some other time you might not have given that the same kind of consideration. So that there's the racial social justice, but there's other ways too that when you're thinking about how are we really going to evaluate this program, it's the more out of the box and the more thought that can go into doing that, the more successful the audit's going to be. And I know that your office has done a real good job at that, but it's a huge challenge to find the right criteria and standards.
Yeah, Bob, I would agree. That is that's, and I don't want to put down my colleagues who do financial auditing, but financial auditing, it's a little more set about what your criteria are going to be. Performance auditing, that's often the major intellectual exercise or challenge, like what standard, because sometimes there are not any obvious ones. And so you hit the nail on the head with that, Bob. I agree.
Great. So then Cheryl, you raise your hand too. So I want to make sure.
Just a quick question. That was a very thoughtful presentation, David. I enjoyed it. And your implementation rate is very high and impressive, and I understand why, you have pending ones. But are you reporting in your annual report elsewhere the other impacts that you have? You talked about effects. So are you, cost savings,
Yeah.
social justice, et cetera?
Yeah, we have an annual report that we're actually required to, actually every city department, I think, except the legislative department, the council is required to do an annual report under the city charter. And we do talk about some of those things that we do. But I think we could do a better job of articulating that, particularly on cost savings. Let me just say one thing here. Sometimes that's a really interesting issue to talk about, like how explicitly you should devote plans of your audits to go out and then get cost savings, because that can affect the type of audits you do. There's also what I think we tend to do more of is prevent there from being problems in the first place. And for example, our latest, I think the thing that comes to mind is a year or two ago, we did an audit looking on incentive zoning in the city. And when we went into it, the primary issue wasn't, oh, we're going to find monies. But when we did the audit, and actually Virginia Garcia was the AIC, the auditor in charge of that, we found that the city hadn't collected, I think it was like $4 to $5 million worth of money it was owed from developers to build affordable housing. So sometimes you could just, in the course of doing that, run into that as an issue. But just commenting on that. But yeah, we do report on that. But I'd love your suggestions on how maybe we can do it more systematically.
Yeah. All right. Well, here, just so we don't run out of time or run the Inspector General's presentation short, why don't we move on? So Lisa, I'll let you take it away. And maybe just as a little bit of background for the folks who aren't familiar with the Seattle system, in addition to David, who is our general City of Seattle auditor, the City of Seattle has an office in the Inspector General responsible for the auditing function of the police department. That's a fairly recent office that's been created in the wake of our federal consent decree over the City of Seattle for investigating use of force and driving reforms of our police department. And part of that has been the creation of an independent Inspector General to make sure that we have a dedicated auditing authority to drive home those reforms and make sure that we're constantly looking at our police department. So that's just an explanation for those who might have been unfamiliar about why we have these kind of two different auditors. But with that, Lisa, I'll let you take it away. You can talk about your office much more authoritatively than I can. So turn it over to you.
I'm gonna try. So Parker's loading up our presentation, and unlike David, we weren't really asked to provide a lot of very specific information about our office. So what you're getting today is sort of my my best explanation of what we do, how our functions are different than David, and